Hi, everyone. My name is Tanya Greaser, and I am the Family Services Educator with HSC. I'm pleased today to be introducing my colleagues from the Family Services team who will be discussing relationships and boundaries with you. First, I'd like to introduce you to Corey Janke.
Hi, guys.
Corey is HSC's hardworking national social worker. Next up, we have our three amazing Resource Center Directors, or RCDs, as you may know them. Starting in the Atlantic provinces, we have Marthe Gautreau. She is the RCD for New Brunswick, and Elaine Smith
Hi, everyone.
is the RCD in Newfoundland and Labrador. And last but not least is Rhonda Romolock Rhonda?
Hi, everybody.
For the Resource Center Director in my home province of British Columbia. There will be time for Q&A after the presentation. Please use the questions tab to the right to ask any questions that you have. And I'm going to let the team take it from there.
Okay, just waiting on the slide to change. Oh, here we go. All right. So welcome everyone to our presentation on relationships and boundaries. We are all members of the Huntington Society of Canada, and our mission as an organization is to improve the quality of life for those affected by Huntington's disease. And our vision is to have a world free from Huntington's disease. Our objective today is just to start a conversation to share information about relationships and boundaries. As humans, we are hardwired for connection. It is a necessity for our survival. Belonging or attaching ourselves to others offers us protection and safety. As children, we lay down templates or internal working models about how the world works based on the primary relationships with our care providers. And this experience follows us throughout all relationships moving forward, for better or for worse. So what is a relationship? A relationship is the way that we connect to people, places, and things. Like it or not, we're related to a lot of stuff in a lot of ways, and relationships are never static. They are dynamic and they change over time. Today, we'll be talking mostly about relationships with people. Maintaining a strong relationship. Relationships with people are extremely important because we are social creatures. Like it or not, even the biggest introvert needs people in their life in order to function at their best. Relationships with people are the most meaningful and yet the most complicated. When we are together with others, we are stronger than when we're on our own, and the better the bond, the better the outcome. So again, maintaining a strong relationship requires constant care and attention. Certain traits have been found to be equally and especially important for fostering healthy relationships. So communication helps us to meet our needs, it provides information and guidance, and it allows us to pass down cultural traditions, norms, and values. Honesty is another one of these important ingredients to relationships because it facilitates trust and safety within that relationship. Another aspect is respect. Respect is something that is, particularly in the 21st century, demonstrates emotional and physical fairness within the relationship, especially in the distribution of chores or responsibilities. Trust is very important in relationships. It makes it easier for us to afford the other the benefit of the doubt, which then creates a sense of being on the same team. Shared goals is important because a collective focus and a desired outcome is much better than just a single focus. Compromise is extremely important in relationships. Good compromises help you and another grow as a team. It fosters trust, accountability, consistency, and security in a relationship. And compromise shows that we have a common goal in mind and that a healthy partnership is in order instead of selfish or single happiness. Appropriate boundaries are so important. Personal boundaries are so important because they set the stage and basic guidelines about how we want to be treated. Setting boundaries can ensure that relationships can be mutually respectful, appropriate, and caring. And last but not least, and this is not an exhaustive list at all, but forgiveness. Forgiveness can help you feel more satisfied in your relationships, sustain your relationship through difficult times, and overall help your relationship function better. Communication is a transfer of information from one person, group, or place to another. It's often a simple act, however, it is extremely complicated. Typically, communication should involve a sender, the message, and a receiver. It's the sender's function to encode the message, including both verbal and nonverbal communication. The role of the receiver is to decode the message. It is a reciprocal exchange of giving, receiving, and understanding the intended message. So why is it so hard? Well, communication becomes complicated because the message is not clear, making it difficult for the receiver of the information to interpret it correctly. Oftentimes, the individual assumes that if the communication partner cared or knew them well enough, then they should understand and know exactly what it is that they meant or what they need. Why is communication so important? Communication is key to any relationship because it keeps the relationship healthy. It can help solve misunderstandings. It can help get to know one another. It can help individuals learn to respect one another and their differences. And it can prevent guesswork, therefore increasing the amount of trust within the relationship. However, fear is a huge barrier in terms of our communication. Most of us hate the feeling of being vulnerable, and so we kind of avoid that at all costs, even to the point of saying things or not saying things. The other biggest fear that we have is the fear of rejection. Another barrier to good communication is the lack of a common language. In English, for example, we have a lot of words that mean different things, but are the exact same word, and that can be very confusing. I was listening to a podcast not all that long ago, and a woman was talking about a good friend of hers who English is her second language, and she's a brilliant scholar. And she had said jokingly at one point that no one even knew how brilliant she really was because she didn't have the language in order to let people know that. She had to speak in very basic language, which then gives the perception that maybe she didn't have the same level of intelligence as she knew she did. And last, most of us have poor role modeling or lack of appropriate role modeling when it comes to communication because we don't do it very well. So what are some tips to help improve our communication? So use simple and straightforward language. Remember, vulnerability is our friend. When we actually present to people that we are close to in a more vulnerable state, it draws the relationship closer together. It increases, again, trust, and it allows us to work more as humans as opposed to robots. Engage your conversation partner. Ask questions about them. Make sure that they understood your message. Offer things in a very kind way. Develop your listening skills. Active listening is a term that social workers use all the time, and many of us believe that we are very good listeners. And in fact, most often we can be really great listeners as long as the topic is cheerful and gentle. But as it gets a little bit more complicated, our defenses kind of go up, and oftentimes we stop listening as we're starting to create our response to the individual's statement towards us. And so that can lead to a lot of challenges because we don't listen to 2/3 of a sentence. We've already started to reply based on what we think they're going to say. Save the big deals for big deals. And as a general rule of thumb, lead with your heart and with respect, even during difficult conversations. What are some things that erode relationships? Secrets. Secrets block intimacy by eroding trust and authenticity. Secrets lead to cover up lies and omissions, which are hard to remember. And sometimes, if and when the truth does come out, it makes the original secret even more hurtful. Assumptions. Assumptions inhibit open communication because we aren't considering the other person fully. We make assumptions based only on a bit of information, for example, a stereotype. Self-centeredness. A lack of understanding or empathy often results in opposition, not collaboration. Not least, stubbornness or inflexibility. Rigidity does not allow for compromise or forgiveness in relationships. So let's bring HD into the mix. HD, by its very nature, raises the stakes of all relationships. We know that the disease automatically will eventually start to pose communication impairment for the individual with the disease. And that can make communication even more challenging in order for that individual to try to make sure her needs or his needs are being heard and met. Because HD is runs in the family, this creates a lot of different dynamics like secrets, various perspectives, not wanting to hurt people's feelings, as well as all the emotions that go along with the grief associated with this disease. In HD families, roles are often blurred, and oftentimes young carers end up caring for their adult parents, possibly prior to a normal developmental stage or age. Many times, many people are using various roles and having to change hats all the time, which can make things a little bit more complicated. And this disease, as we know, is progressive and continually requires us to adapt. As soon as there is a change in function, the whole family has to kind of figure out what that new equilibrium is going to look like. And it seems like sometimes we just kind of get our feet underneath us, and then there's another change, and that requires the whole thing to repeat its process. So it can change over time, which then requires us to continually figure things out over and over again. As this disease progresses, there are new people that are being introduced all the time. There may be multiple service providers like speech language pathologists or home care workers coming and going in and out of the house. And that can be really challenging, particularly for some people who have very significant needs for privacy. And also, this disease creates a lot of what ifs. And again, what ifs can lead to assumptions, fears, and misunderstandings, and therefore it complicates everything. All right, I'm turning it over to Marthe now. You there, Marthe?
Marthe seems to be having just a little bit of IT trouble, so we'll just give her a minute to let the live stream catch up. I'm sure she's going to pop on here any minute. I'm just going to help you out, Marthe, by clicking your camera and your mic for you. Give it 1 sec here. You're unmuted and your camera's on. We'll just give it a sec to catch up. IT is so much fun sometimes, right, guys?
It doesn't let me turn my camera off even.
Okay. Let's see what's going on. All right. Let's see. I think we're going to get some IT help here just to help us along.
I'm here.
Hi. So we can't seem to bring Marthe on to camera and mic and turn Corey off.
Okay. So Corey needs to stop sharing.
Corey's going to be moving the slides though.
Oh, is he? Okay.
Yeah.
And so we want Mark to have his camera on. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay. Mark, can you unmute your microphone that you can speak to us?
She's showing as unmuted and their camera's on the panel.
So yeah, not for me, she isn't.
Oh, okay.
So that's the thing. Marthe, I'm going to ask you to do something, and hopefully you can hear me. What I'd like you to do is I need you to go up into the top left-hand side of the screen beside the menu bar in your browser, beside the little house icon. I need you to push the reload this page button, please. So you're going to disappear and come back in, and this should reset your settings. And she heard me. We'll just watch for her to come back.
Okay, it worked.
There we are.
Okay, thank you. Sorry about that. It's true. When technology works, it's great, but when it doesn't, it's not so good.
When all else fails, reboot, reboot, reboot.
Okay.
So,
All
can I
right.
ask a question before we get moving? Because I'm going to be moving the slides, I can't disable my camera. Is that right?
Your camera's disabled. We don't see you. We see Tanya, but we don't see Corey.
Okay.
Okay, good enough then.
Okay. So what are boundaries? I'm going to ask you to do a little bit of work here. I'm going to ask you to stop and think about different questions that I'm going to be asking you. Think about this for yourself. So what do you think? Do we all have boundaries? Are boundaries the same as everyone else? Or are they different? Can you decide what goes inside your boundary and what stays outside your boundary? Next slide, please, Corey. Who am I? A sense of self. It is who you are, your unique identity. We all have our own personality traits, different abilities, likes and dislikes, what you believe in, what is important to you, what motivates you, your values, and I could go on and on. All of these contribute to make you unique. Next slide, please. Boundaries defines us. This is me and this is you. How do you know where you end and the other begins? Or where others end and you begin? May sound funny to talk that way, but I think you're going to get it. Just give it a minute. Everything inside my boundary is me, and everything outside my boundary is not me. We can choose what to allow into our boundaries and what to leave outside. This leads to understand that we can choose what to allow into our boundaries and what to leave outside our boundary. Next slide. The importance of boundaries. Boundaries are essential to knowing and taking care of ourselves. When we're in a carer's role without boundaries, we experience more resentment, frustration, fatigue, and burnout. Boundaries makes caring more sustainable. Without boundaries, we are vulnerable to compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma. These are much more complicated than being tired and overworked. We hear a lot about being overtired and overworked, but maybe not this one. This is a combination of both the compassion fatigue and vicarious trauma, and they often caused by conflict with our deepest values and the work that we are expected to do. Next slide, please. I'm going to share with you a family situation, a situation that maybe some of you have already experienced or are experiencing it now, or you know someone who are going through this kind of situation. So this is the story of the youngest sibling of a family of four siblings. And it's the youngest sibling that took on the care of her parents because of her deep values and attachment. The three older siblings are not as involved in caring for their parents because they live in a different province, they're retired, or they're traveling. The youngest sibling, as the main carer, felt she had no more me time, and she took a leave of absence from her employment. At times, she felt alone, discouraged, tired, frustrated, and resentful. She kept her feelings to herself as she wanted to protect the relationship with her family. The carer neglected her own needs and set no boundaries with her siblings. Now I'm going to share something with you. The youngest sibling in this story, family situation, if you like, is me. This is me about 15 years ago. You could say I was unboundaried. I had no limits. I really felt taken on, I guess, by maybe emotions too. I was tired. My mom wasn't doing so well. Was hospitalized for 6 months, and that was during the time I was off from work. So I really got caught up into it. And by having no set boundaries, I really neglected my own needs. So why are boundaries so important? Boundaries show respect for the autonomy and independence of others. We need to allow space for the person to do what they can do on their own, because that's being respectful, and it makes them feel good to see that there are still things they can do for themselves. When a person has no boundaries, they have no set limits. Like I didn't have set limits a little while back with that story. So they could be considered unboundaried. So unboundaried persons, they'll meet the boundaries of others first, and often don't even recognize the boundaries of others. Their own needs are neglected, and they try to get their own needs met through other people. All people are both boundaried and unboundaried at times. I now pass that along to Elaine.
Elaine's having difficulty as well at the moment.
IT is working on it here, Elaine, so just hang tight. We're not going to leave you hanging.
Hi, Elaine. It's Dave here. I think we're going to have to go through the actions of resetting your screens as well. Corey, if you wouldn't mind, I'm going to ask you to go to the bottom and go to your settings, near your settings, and turn off your camera. Elaine, I need you to go to the top left-hand side of your screen in your browser beside the little house and hit the circle to reload the page. You'll leave and come back, and it should reboot your camera and microphone. Hopefully you can hear me.
Dave, it won't let me change my settings.
Okay, I've tried it on my end here. We'll see what happens.
Hi.
There's Elaine.
Okay.
Good stuff.
So will I just continue on from here, guys? Yes. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the different types of boundaries. So now that we know what boundaries are, like I said, I will talk about the different types. There are 3 different types of boundaries: vague, healthy, and rigid. Corey, you can change the slide if you can. So when we have vague boundaries, we have trouble saying no and setting limits. We often say yes to everything. But it's important when we do say yes to everything that we look out for our own well-being, so that we're not saying, when we are saying yes to everyone else, that we are not saying no to ourselves. When we have vague boundaries, we put other people's needs and desires first, even when it harms us. This can often lead to burnout as we overextend ourselves in order to help other people. We act on behalf of others. We have trouble seeing or respecting other people's boundaries. So this can involve caretaking, giving advice, getting involved, problem solving, and all forms of helping that involve doing for someone else what they are capable of doing for themselves. This can often lead to the other people losing their independence if we do too much for them. As well, with vague boundaries, we fear losing connections with others by meeting our own needs. We see our connection to others as more important than our connection to ourselves. And because we value that connection, we often do for others rather than doing for ourselves. So an example of a vague boundary would be something like, so we're a caregiver to a person with HD. And because we value this connection to this person, we do too much for them. For example, when just think of this scenario of someone dressing. Sometimes people with HD, it might take them a lot longer to get dressed. But, we would say, okay, no, that's fine. I'll do that for you. And we go ahead and do that for them. So this is causing this other person to lose their independence. And as well for us, doing too much can often lead to burnout. I will now go on and talk about rigid boundaries. Often when we choose rigid boundaries, we often choose rigid boundaries after having vague boundaries and getting hurt. So now, instead of saying yes to everything, the pendulum swings the other way and we say no to everything. We keep a distance from others because this feels safer. This kind of boundary is often like an 8-foot wall. We isolate ourselves from others for fear of getting hurt or rejected. We feel a need to protect ourselves. And because of this need to protect ourselves, we have very few relationships with others. Next slide. We are afraid to connect with others because we are afraid to lose a sense of connection to ourselves. So we often avoid intimacy in close relationships. However, when we do form a relationship with others, we're often guarded in sharing our emotions or anything, really personal. We say no frequently, and sometimes we might feel grumpy afterwards, and this might bring on feelings of regret. And sometimes not only the regret, but you may feel guilty for saying no. And sometimes when we say no more forcefully than we meant to. Again, adding more feelings of regret, like, geez, why did I have to go off my head and say no like that? That kind of thing. So when you have rigid boundaries, you often have rigid rules about what you want to do and when you want to do them. You won't make any exceptions or be flexible. So an example of a rigid boundary would be something like, your Aunt Mary is coming into town for dinner and for the weekend, and she's asked you to meet her at a Mexican restaurant for dinner. And you find that, well, gee, Mexican gives me heartburn, so you say no and you don't go. But afterwards, you feel that regret, because not only are you disappointing your Aunt Mary, who, you haven't seen in a long while, but you're disappointing yourself and you're missing out on a lovely evening. So, not only do you feel the feelings of regret, but you may also feel guilty for not going. So as you've heard, both vague and or rigid boundaries can have negative consequences. They sit at opposite ends of the spectrum. So Rhonda will now join us to talk about healthy boundaries.
Thanks, Elaine. So my colleagues have shared information on relationships and boundaries, what they are, why they are important, and what makes rigid ones. Now we'll look at healthy boundaries. Corey, if you could change the slide, please. And if you look at this slide, it describes some of the aspects of them. And I'd like you to do something similar to what Mark talked about. If you could take a moment, think about the categories that we were talking about. Where do you think your boundaries would fit? Are they vague? Are they rigid? Or are they healthy? It may be a mix, and it likely depends on whether it applies to work or home, or what type of relationship. Is it with a friend, a colleague, or a family member? We're not perfect, and it takes practice to get where we want to be with setting healthy boundaries. Next slide. Thanks, Corey.
You're welcome.
So this is an overview of the foundation of healthy boundaries. And I think throughout our presentation, we've really talked a lot about understanding ourselves, whether it's relationships or boundaries or most aspects of our lives. So as we figure out our needs, thoughts, and feelings, it becomes easier to take responsibility for setting boundaries and respecting other boundaries. It helps us recognize that our boundaries and needs can be different from others. Once we understand what our boundary is and we want to share it with someone, it helps to do this clearly and respectfully. And it doesn't have to be a long conversation. I mean, it can, but sometimes it's okay just to be clear and just share what your thoughts and feelings are. You might also get a reaction from the other person, especially if they're not used to you setting boundaries. So you don't need to justify that or apologize. And when there is adjustments, there can also be a feeling of guilt, or maybe you're afraid of being rejected. And that can also, both of those can stop us from really wanting to set them. It's that uncertainty. One of the things that, I'm sorry, I've gone a little bit too far ahead. That's the next slide, Corey. So one of the things that when I work with families and we talk about how everyone has the same dance, because, relationships, and you kind of get into these patterns. So one person changes the steps and then the steps become out of sync until everyone adjusts to the new steps. So it's kind of the same when you're setting a boundary. So, you've got a relationship, things have been going a certain way, and now you're changing that. So, this is something you might experience when you go from vague or rigid boundaries. And I think, on the other side, we talked about intellectual, emotional, and physical boundaries. And some of them are easier or harder to establish. I mean, a physical boundary can be more apparent, right? So, somebody stands too close or they lean in and you get that feeling, right? It's uncomfortable. So you might step back. So really you're physically creating a boundary. So, you can think about, is there one that I want to change? How do I do that? And then hopefully some of the information we share today will help you with that. And then Corey's going to finish it up for us here.
All right. Thank you, Rhonda. So we've thrown a lot of information at you in a short period of time and a month. So thank you for your patience. And, this is hard stuff. We take so much for granted in terms of relationships and communication and boundaries. And what we've learned is that boundaries are not just physical boundaries. So if you're struggling in this and you are additional support, please don't feel like you're alone. The Huntington Society of Canada is fortunate enough to have individual RCD and social workers across the country. And if you haven't connected to yours as of yet, or to the individual that's closest to you, that on our website, at the Huntington Society of Canada website, we do have a map that indicates where all the resource center directors and family service workers are located. And I encourage you to take a minute to take a look at that and connect with your social worker who can help you in this, whether they can do it themselves or whether they can help you locate resources in your community that would also be able to help you. So I want to again thank you for your attention and your patience. And now we are going to turn it over to questions.
Thanks, everyone. So we've got a few questions that I want to start with. So first one is actually a really great comment that I just wanted to share so that everyone heard. So Lori felt like a worksheet on setting boundaries might be something that might be helpful in the future. And I think that really could be useful as well for other people. So I just wanted to, not really a question, but I wanted to pass that on. And Jody had a question about privacy. So how is privacy respected in a family that ends up divorced with shared children at risk? Specifically, she's thinking a malicious ex trying to use HD as a custody issue. Is there maybe a more rigid privacy policy available for a parent with HD to reduce access to their HD care team? Does anyone think they can address that? Divorce is always tricky.
Yeah, I wonder if I might just have a comment about that. That unfortunately we can't control what other people do with our information. We can control what we share, and we often will talk about the difference between secrecy and privacy. But we can't necessarily do that. But the Non-Discrimination Act that is out there now could be used to help the individual who is their HD status is being used against them, if you will. And that's a pretty hard boundary right there because it can lead to hefty fines and human rights issues.
Good point. Thank you, Corey. Holly Ann has a question about if someone would please address spiritual well-being and maintenance of healthy boundaries. Anyone address? That's a tough one as well.
Can you read it again out loud for me?
Sure. So Holly Ann's question specifically says, please address spiritual well-being and maintenance of healthy boundaries.
So that one's I'd need a bit more information on that. So would that be, do you think, setting up a boundary so that your own spirituality is respected?
That's a great follow-up. Holly Ann, if you're still with us, if you're able to maybe comment a little more in the questions box, we can get with that. And how about we come back to that? We'll come back to that one. And in the meantime, I've got a couple other questions that we can address, and I'll keep an eye on the screen for you, Holly Ann. So how about, is it difficult to go from rigid to healthy boundaries?
I can try to answer that. I would think
Sure.
that it's really an individual thing. For sure, a person that has rigid boundaries would be a real learning curve for them to come to healthy boundaries. But I think with a lot of efforts and practice, a person can certainly get there.
And I think the other thing too to remember is we don't have to change that with every person. So as we become more aware of who we are, how we want to change those boundaries, you can practice and then implement. So you could, maybe start with one person. You don't have to start with sort of the most important relationship in your life. You can start in, small pieces, because it's a big job when you're learning about yourself, trying to make some changes. What's that relationship mean to you? What are the outcomes or the consequences if you try and implement a boundary? So there's a lot of things to think about. And I think it can be done in increments.
Yeah, I see it as baby steps, right?
Yes.
And I often will talk to people when I'm helping them with boundary setting, to kind of recognize the difference between assertiveness and aggression or passive behavior or communication. And for somebody who has been more passive in their approach, and they're kind of getting their self-esteem up, or they're, that's allowing them to set better boundaries, I always let them know that it's going to feel very uncomfortable because you're not used to it. So I always say it's like a nice, brand new, crisp shirt that's very well starched. It looks great, but it doesn't feel comfortable until you work it in. And that's the way that this kind of change is like. It's going to be helpful. It's going to be great at the end, but the growing pains of going from where you are to where you want to be can be very uncomfortable for a bit.
Excellent. So a couple more questions have come in while we've been chatting. Maria says, how do you maintain healthy boundaries with an HD individual that doesn't respect your boundaries?
It's challenging for sure. And again, in theory, all of these things make a lot of sense, and in practicality, they're a little bit more complicated sometimes to put in. But I think, the more, Maria, you're able to know exactly where your line starts and stops, and putting some things into place around that can be helpful. Clearly, it's a little bit more difficult if the individual is living in the same home in order to kind of enforce those. Sometimes, if that's the case, then you need to go into a different room. I've often suggested to people that they put a do not disturb sign on, just to kind of help with the individual if they have a bit of impulsivity, or using whiteboards and saying, you know what, I'm going to be back in an hour. I'm just going to go for a walk, and, put the time on there, so that you get your time away that you need to kind of recharge or to kind of cool off. So being very, very specific can be, I guess, the best way, in my opinion, to kind of establish that, recognizing, though, it's very complicated and difficult.
Thank you, Corey. We have one more question here from Jody, and I think this falls very naturally into place. So does a social worker ever help speak with family members about desired boundaries to assist a person with HD in communicating effectively?
Can you hear me? If you can, I'll take that. It's Elaine here. Yes, a social worker would. So what I would suggest is that you reach out to your RCD in your area and have, and then where you could discuss it with one another, and maybe they can sort of put a plan in place. But a lot of it is, a lot of consistency, um, a lot of routine, that kind of thing, so that the person with HD sort of knows what to expect, and you could sit and just basically use the same tone, use the same thing every time. The consistency is the key, kind of thing.
Wonderful. So I'm going to wrap that up. We're out of, sorry. No, sorry. Okay. We're going to wrap that up because we are out of time. Holly Ann, I'm going to make sure that you are connected with the RCD in your area to get clarification on your question, to make sure that that you get your question answered. And I want to thank our panelists. I want to thank everyone for their patience and understanding as we struggled through IT. Everyone was a trooper, so good job to our panelists for that. And we're going to move on now to our closing presentation. So thanks so much for joining us.
Bye.
Bye, guys.